December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under a suffocating weight of snow. Pines bent low, their branches heavy with ice. The wind howled through narrow valleys, carrying with it the muffled growl of engines. On a twisting road, headlights cut through the blizzard. Convoys of American trucks crawled forward, their tires chained, their drivers hunched over frozen steering wheels. Inside the cabs, men wore every scrap of clothing they owned, yet the cold still gnawed at their bones. Frost clung to windshields, rifles rattled against metal frames, and the smell of gasoline mixed with the sharp sting of winter air. To the Germans, this terrain had always been a shield. In 1940, they had used its dense forests to outflank France. By 1944, they believed the same wilderness would now break the Allies. Impassable, unforgiving, a natural fortress. But on this night, in the heart of the Ardennes, the impossible was happening. Convoys rolled forward, defying snow, terrain, and enemy fire. The forest that once gave Germany victory was about to witness its undoing. The Ardennes, a stretch of dense forest, rolling hills, and narrow valleys straddling Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeastern France. For centuries, it had been seen less as a battlefield and more as a barrier. Its ridges were steep, its rivers unpredictable, and its roads few and winding. In summer, the terrain was difficult. In winter, it became a frozen labyrinth. Military planners across Europe had long dismissed it as unsuitable for large-scale mechanized warfare. Tanks would bog down, convoys would choke on the single-lane roads, infantry would freeze in the valleys. To most generals, the Ardennes was a natural wall, a place to anchor defenses, not to launch offensives. Yet history had already proven them wrong once. In May 1940, German panzer divisions under Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian had stormed through the Ardennes in a lightning strike that bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line. French commanders had believed the forest would slow the Germans for weeks. Instead, the armored spearheads emerged in days, crossing the Meuse at Sedan and unraveling French defenses. The Ardennes, once thought impassable, had become the very route of France's collapse. That memory lingered. By 1944, Allied commanders were well aware of the German feat of 1940, but the situation had changed. The Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable force it had been. Its divisions were depleted, its fuel reserves dwindling, its Luftwaffe weakened. The Allies, by contrast, had overwhelming superiority in men, machines, and air power. As the Allies advanced after the Normandy landings, their front stretched across northern France and Belgium. By autumn, they had liberated Paris, crossed into Belgium, and reached the borders of Germany. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western wall of bunkers and dragon's teeth, loomed ahead. Eisenhower's armies were exhausted but confident. The Ardennes, lying on the southern flank of the Allied advance, was considered quiet. Thinly held by American divisions, it was seen as a rest sector, a place where green units could acclimate to combat and veteran divisions could recuperate. The terrain itself seemed to guarantee safety. Snow was already falling by November, and the roads were treacherous. Few believed the Germans could mount a serious offensive there. But in Berlin, Adolf Hitler saw the Ardennes differently. He remembered 1940. He believed the Allies, complacent and overextended, would never expect a major attack through the same forest. If Germany could strike there again, it might split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Thus, the Ardennes became the stage for Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. And yet, before the German attack even began, the Ardennes had already shaped Allied thinking. It was a place of underestimation, of assumptions, of misplaced confidence. The very terrain that had once delivered Germany victory was now dismissed as irrelevant. But the forest had one more lesson to teach. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes was shattered. German artillery opened fire along a 50-mile front, unleashing one of the heaviest barrages of the war. Shells rained down on American positions, cutting telephone lines, collapsing dugouts, and throwing stunned soldiers into chaos. Out of the mist and snow, German infantry and tanks surged forward. Hitler's gamble had begun. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. To the Allies, it would soon be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack achieved complete surprise. American units in the Ardennes were thinly spread, many of them inexperienced. The 106th Infantry Division, barely weeks in combat, was struck head-on and encircled. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles. Villages were swallowed in fire and smoke. German armored spearheads, including the feared 1st SS Panzer Division, pushed westward, aiming for the Meuse River and ultimately the port of Antwerp. The weather favored the attackers. A blizzard swept across the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft. For days, the skies remained closed, denying the Americans their greatest advantage, air superiority. Snowdrifts buried roads, ice froze engines, and visibility dropped to near zero. The same storm that shielded the Germans also punished the Allies. For the U.S. Army, the battle became a test of endurance not only at the front but behind it. Every rifleman at Bastogne, every tank in Patton's Third Army, every artillery piece holding the line depended on one thing: supply. Ammunition, fuel, food, and winter clothing had to reach the front through the same narrow, snow-choked roads the Germans had once believed impassable. Convoys became lifelines. Truck drivers, often overlooked in the grand narratives of war, now carried the weight of entire armies. They drove through whiteouts, headlights dimmed to slits, engines straining against ice. German patrols and infiltrators lurked in the woods, ambushing stragglers. Bridges were blown, detours endless. Yet the convoys rolled on. The Ardennes, once thought to be a natural fortress, had become a battlefield of movement. The Germans sought to exploit its cover for surprise. The Americans sought to defy its winter fury with logistics. And in that struggle, the myth of the impassable Ardennes would be broken once more. The Ardennes convoys were not faceless machines of war. They were driven by men young, often inexperienced, many of them barely out of training. Truck drivers of the U.S. Army's Red Ball Express and its successor supply routes had already proven their endurance in France. But in the Ardennes, the challenge was unlike anything they had faced. The blizzard was merciless. Temperatures plunged below freezing, snow piled high on the roads, and frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. Drivers wrapped their hands in rags when gloves wore through. Some tied scarves around their faces, leaving only narrow slits for their eyes. Sleep was rare. Convoys moved at night to avoid detection, headlights dimmed to slivers, engines rumbling through the dark. Every mile carried risk. German patrols prowled the forests. Snipers targeted exposed drivers. Infiltrators dressed in American uniforms set up false checkpoints, sowing confusion. Yet the convoys pressed forward. Soldiers later recalled the eerie silence of the woods, broken only by the crunch of tires on ice and the sudden crack of rifle fire. For these men, survival was not just about courage. It was about endurance, the ability to keep moving when every instinct screamed to stop. Their struggle gave the front-line divisions the ammunition, fuel, and food they needed to hold the line. The Ardennes was a logistical nightmare. Its geography offered few roads, most of them narrow, twisting, and easily blocked. Snow and ice turned them into treacherous paths where a single stalled truck could halt an entire column. Bridges became choke points, vulnerable to demolition or ambush. American commanders quickly realized that convoy discipline was as important as firepower. Trucks were spaced carefully to avoid pileups. Engineers worked around the clock to clear snow, repair bridges, and carve alternate routes through the forest. Military police directed traffic at crossroads, often under fire, ensuring that the lifeline of supplies never stopped flowing. The Germans understood the stakes. Their strategy depended on speed, capturing Allied fuel dumps to keep their tanks moving. When that failed, they turned to ambushes. Panzer grenadiers and paratroopers struck at convoys, hoping to sever the arteries of the American counterattack. But the U.S. adapted. Convoys traveled with armed escorts. Machine guns mounted on half-tracks and jeeps provided covering fire. Drivers learned to push through ambush zones, never stopping, never giving the enemy a stationary target. The Ardennes became a chessboard of movement. Every convoy that reached Bastogne or Patton's Third Army was a tactical victory, denying the Germans the chance to exploit their initial breakthrough. The trucks themselves became unsung heroes of the battle. The U.S. relied heavily on the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, the Deuce and a Half. Rugged, reliable, and mass-produced, it was the backbone of Allied logistics. With snow chains fitted to their tires, these vehicles clawed their way through ice and mud, carrying everything from artillery shells to rations. Fuel was the most precious cargo. Without it, tanks and aircraft were useless. Convoys hauled thousands of gallons in jerrycans and tank trailers, often under constant threat of fire. Mechanics worked in freezing conditions to keep engines running, improvising repairs with whatever parts they could salvage. Technology also meant adaptation. Snowplows were attached to trucks to clear paths. Portable heaters were used to thaw frozen engines. Radios coordinated movements across the forest, though static and weather often silenced them. The Germans, by contrast, faced a crippling shortage of fuel and spare parts. Their tanks, powerful on paper, often sat idle for lack of gasoline. Abandoned panthers and tigers littered the roadsides, silent monuments to a logistical failure. The Americans, with their convoys grinding forward through the storm, turned technology and supply into weapons as decisive as any rifle or cannon. The human struggle, the tactical discipline, and the technological backbone all converged in the Ardennes. Together, they transformed the impassable forest into a corridor of survival. Next came the decisions of leaders and the perspectives of enemies, the other angles that shaped this battle. The Ardennes convoys were not only a triumph of endurance on the ground but also of leadership at the highest levels. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, understood that logistics would decide the battle as much as firepower. His staff worked tirelessly to reroute supplies, prioritize fuel, and keep the arteries of war flowing. George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, became the embodiment of decisive leadership. When the German offensive struck, Patton pivoted his entire army northward in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. But such a move was meaningless without supply. Patton's tanks needed fuel, his infantry needed ammunition, and his artillery needed shells. Convoys became the invisible extension of his command. Behind the front, lesser-known officers, quartermasters, engineers, traffic controllers made decisions that carried the weight of entire divisions. They calculated how many gallons of fuel could reach Bastogne, how many tons of ammunition could be pushed through snowbound roads, how many trucks could survive the journey. Their leadership was quiet, often overlooked, but decisive. For the Germans, the Ardennes was both opportunity and trap. Hitler believed the forest would conceal his buildup and shield his advance. In the opening days, it seemed to work. American lines buckled, villages fell, and German columns surged westward. But the same terrain that once gave them victory in 1940 now betrayed them. Fuel shortages crippled their advance. Every mile gained consumed precious gasoline. Capturing Allied fuel dumps became a desperate priority. When convoys slipped through the blizzard to resupply American forces, they denied the Germans the very resource they needed most. German commanders like Sepp Dietrich and Otto von Manschufel recognized the danger. They saw their tanks stranded on icy roads, their infantry exhausted, their timetable collapsing. The Ardennes, far from being a highway to Antwerp, became a graveyard of stalled vehicles and broken hopes. From the German perspective, the sight of American convoys grinding forward through the storm was devastating. It meant the Allies could absorb the blow, regroup, and strike back. The forest that had once been their ally now seemed to conspire against them. War is not only fought with weapons but with will. In the Ardennes, morale became a weapon as powerful as any tank. For the Americans, the sight of convoys arriving through the snow was more than a logistical success, it was a lifeline of hope. Soldiers in foxholes at Bastogne, cut off and surrounded, cheered when supplies finally reached them. The knowledge that they were not forgotten, that the lifelines still held, gave them strength to endure. For the drivers themselves, the moral burden was immense. They knew that failure was not an option. A stalled truck could mean a starving battalion. A lost convoy could mean a broken defense. Each mile carried not only cargo but the weight of lives depending on them. The Germans, by contrast, saw their morale erode with every abandoned tank, every empty fuel drum, every failed ambush. The Ardennes blizzard, once their shield, became their tormentor. The longer the convoys rolled, the clearer it became, the offensive was doomed. The Ardennes blizzard of December 1944 was more than weather. It was a force of war. Snow fell in relentless sheets, burying tanks, silencing artillery, and turning roads into white rivers of ice. Visibility dropped to a few yards. Engines froze solid overnight. Soldiers woke to find their rifles encased in frost. For the Germans, the storm was both ally and enemy. It grounded Allied aircraft, giving their armored columns freedom to move without fear of strafing thunderbolts and Mustangs. but it also slowed their advance. Fuel trucks skidded off roads. Tanks stalled on icy inclines. Supply lines stretched thin, and every mile westward consumed gasoline they could not replace. For the Americans, the storm was a crucible. Convoys became the only thread holding the front together. Drivers pushed through whiteouts, headlights dimmed, following the faint glow of the truck ahead. If one vehicle slid into a ditch, the entire column risked collapse. Men climbed out into the storm, ropes in hand, straining to pull trucks back onto the road while snow lashed their faces. German infiltrators added to the chaos. Wearing stolen American uniforms, they set up false checkpoints, misdirecting convoys into ambushes. Rumors spread of enemy commandos disguised as MPs, asking drivers trick questions about baseball or state capitals to expose them. Trust eroded. Every intersection became a test of nerves. Yet the convoys endured. In the worst nights of December, when Bastogne was surrounded and its defenders were down to their last shells, trucks clawed their way through the storm. Some carried ammunition, others medical supplies, others fuel and precious jerrycans. Each delivery meant another day of resistance. The blizzard that was meant to paralyze instead became a proving ground. The Germans had counted on weather to cripple the Allies. Instead, it revealed their resilience. And as the storm raged, a new force was gathering: Patton's Third Army, pivoting northward, fueled and supplied by the very convoys that refused to stop. By late December 1944, the German offensive had reached its high watermark. Their armored spearheads had driven deep into Belgium, creating the Great Bulge in the Allied lines. But the advance was slowing. Fuel shortages, icy roads, and stiffening American resistance drained momentum. The Ardennes, once their cloak of surprise, was now a cage. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units were surrounded. The town was a vital crossroads, and the Germans knew its capture would open the way west. For days, Bastogne endured artillery barrages, tank assaults, and the bitter cold. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition ran low. Medical units worked in cellars lit by candles, treating the wounded with dwindling morphine. The defenders held on, waiting for relief. That relief came from the south. George S. Patton had promised Eisenhower that he could pivot his Third Army northward in days, a maneuver that seemed impossible given the conditions. Yet his staff had prepared meticulously. Convoys had already begun moving fuel and ammunition along the treacherous roads, ensuring that when the order came, his tanks would not stall. On December 22, German envoys approached Bastogne with a demand for surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, gave his famous reply, "Nuts." The defiance symbolized the American will to resist. But defiance alone could not hold without supplies. Convoys, braving the storm, delivered what they could. And then, on December 26, Patton's lead elements broke through. The siege was lifted. The relief of Bastogne marked the turning point. The German timetable was shattered. Their armored columns, already starved of fuel, could not regain momentum. Abandoned tanks littered the roadsides, their hulks half buried in snow. Soldiers trudged back eastward, frostbitten and exhausted. For the Americans, the convoys had proven decisive. They had kept Bastogne alive long enough for Patton to arrive. They had fueled the counterattack that pushed the Germans back. And they had demonstrated that even in the worst winter storm of the war, the Ardennes was not impassable. By early January 1945, the skies cleared. Allied aircraft returned, strafing German columns and bombing supply lines. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble ended as a catastrophic defeat. The Ardennes, once a symbol of German triumph, now stood as the graveyard of their final offensive. The climax had passed. What remained was aftermath, the reckoning of losses, the consequences for both sides, and the lessons etched into history. By January 1945, the Ardennes was no longer a battlefield of advance but a graveyard of ambition. The German offensive, launched with such fury in mid-December, had bled itself dry. What Hitler had envisioned as a decisive strike to split the Allies and capture Antwerp ended in exhaustion, attrition, and retreat. The cost was staggering. German forces lost more than 600 tanks and assault guns, many abandoned on the roadside when fuel ran out. Thousands of vehicles were left behind, their engines frozen, their crews trudging eastward through the snow. Estimates of German casualties range from 80,000 to 100,000 killed, wounded, or captured losses the Reich could not replace. Elite divisions, including the 1st SS Panzer and the 2nd Panzer, were shattered. The Luftwaffe, committed in desperate support, suffered crippling losses in aircraft and pilots. For the Americans, the price was also heavy. Nearly 90,000 casualties were recorded, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement fought by U.S. forces in World War II. Towns like Bastogne, St. Vith, and Houffalize were reduced to rubble. Civilians endured bombardment, displacement, and the bitter cold of a winter that seemed endless. Yet amid the destruction, one fact stood out: the U.S. Army had endured. The German offensive had failed not only because of Allied firepower but because of Allied logistics. Convoys had kept the front alive. They had delivered ammunition to Bastogne, fuel to Patton's tanks, and food to exhausted infantry. They had done so under conditions that seemed impossible: blizzards, ambushes, and roads that swallowed vehicles whole. The Ardennes had been meant to paralyze the Allies. Instead, it revealed their resilience. The German gamble collapsed because their own supply lines could not sustain the offensive, while American convoys proved unstoppable. The forest that had once given Germany victory in 1940 now bore witness to their defeat in 1944–45. The aftermath was clear: the Wehrmacht had spent its last reserves. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final throw of the dice in the West, had failed. The road to the Rhine now lay open. The collapse of the German offensive in the Ardennes was more than a battlefield defeat. It was the breaking of an illusion. For years, the Ardennes had been seen as a place of surprise, a terrain that could tilt the balance of war. In 1940, it had delivered Germany its greatest triumph. In 1944, it became the grave of its last hope. Strategically, the failure of WWII am Rhine sealed Germany's fate in the West. The Wehrmacht had committed its last reserves, men, tanks, and fuel, to the Ardennes gamble. When it failed, there was nothing left to replace them. The divisions shattered in the snow could not be rebuilt. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The Reich's ability to mount another large-scale offensive was gone forever. For the Allies, the victory was costly but decisive. The U.S. Army had endured its bloodiest battle of the war, yet it emerged stronger. The logistical system, tested under the most brutal conditions, had proven itself. Convoys had not only sustained the defense but enabled the counterattack. The myth of the impassable Ardennes was shattered not by tanks charging through in summer, but by trucks grinding forward in winter. The psychological impact was profound. For German soldiers, the Ardennes offensive had been a final chance to turn the tide. Its failure left only retreat and defense. For American soldiers, the victory was a testament to resilience. Bastogne became a symbol of defiance. Patton's maneuver became a symbol of speed and determination. And the convoys, though less celebrated, became the quiet proof that endurance could triumph over surprise. In the months that followed, the Allies pressed forward. By March 1945, they had crossed the Rhine. By May, the war in Europe was over. The Ardennes had not delayed the inevitable, it had accelerated it. The forest that once gave Germany victory had now witnessed its undoing. The Ardennes was no longer a place of German triumph but of German defeat, a reminder that in modern war, belief in terrain, weather, or myth could not overcome the relentless power of logistics and will. The Ardennes was never just a forest. It was a mirror of belief. In 1940, it reflected German daring, a place where the impossible became possible, where tanks rolled through terrain thought impassable and toppled France in weeks. For years later, it reflected something else: endurance, resilience, and the quiet power of logistics. The blizzard of December 1944 was meant to be Germany's ally. It blinded Allied aircraft, cloaked armored columns, and seemed to tilt the battlefield in Hitler's favor. But the storm became a crucible. It tested not only machines and strategies but the will of man. Convoy drivers, engineers, mechanics, and quartermasters, often nameless in the grand sweep of history, proved that wars are not won only by generals or tanks, but by the relentless movement of supplies through the most hostile conditions. The Ardennes became the stage where two myths collided: the German myth of surprise, of terrain as weapon, of one last gamble to change the war, and the American reality of endurance, of convoys grinding forward, of soldiers refusing to yield, of a system that could bend but not break. When the snow cleared, the forest told a different story. Abandoned German tanks lay rusting in the drifts. American trucks, battered but unbroken, had carved paths through the storm. The Ardennes was no longer a symbol of German triumph. It was a testament to Allied resilience. History often remembers the dramatic battles, the famous speeches, the decisive charges. But in the Ardennes, it was the steady hum of engines in the night, the crunch of tires on ice, the stubborn refusal to stop, that decided the outcome. The forest once thought impassable had been crossed again, not by blitzkrieg, but by endurance, not by surprise, but by persistence. And in that persistence lay the quiet truth of modern war. Victory belongs not only to those who strike hardest, but to those who endure longest.